Welcome back to Computer History with Chris Garcia. I am, in fact, Chris Garcia. The late 1950s were a fascinating time for computers. You could say they were still new, and you could also say that they were still feeling around the edges looking for what might become possible. It was clear by this point that they were important technologies to develop, and this is the beginning of businesses beginning to look at them as not only experiments, but as a way to make cash. Major corporations were taking up the task to sell them to companies because companies were recognizing that they needed them. Several established companies would release computers in the late 1950s, including Burroughs, Librascope, Bendix, Honeywell, General Electric, and of course, IBM. IBM was at the head of the pack, and they kept innovating throughout the 1950s. All these computers, by this point, had started to look towards magnetic core memory, though not all deployed them, largely because it was expensive at the time. One thing IBM had managed to do before any of the others was develop a scalable random access storage system. And they did this at the San Jose lab under the direction of Ray Johnson. And that team delivered the IBM 305 RAMAC, which means the 305 Random Access Method of Accounting and Control. This large disk drive system had moving heads, unlike existing drum systems, which usually had fixed heads. That allowed for much faster access of data, and larger data sets as well. It was designed as secondary storage, though it wasn't long before methods of using it as semi-primary storage were developed. The introduction of disk drives led to the concept of virtual memory, and we'll talk about that down the line, don't worry. The 305 had about 1,000 installations, and uses were both governmental and commercial. One of the most visible was the delivery of the system to the 1960 Winter Olympics in what was called then Squaw Valley in Lake Tahoe, California. Or maybe it was Nevada. I can never keep track what side it's on. IBM gave them an entire system with printer and other I/O options. Thomas Watson famously allowed one of them to be sent to Russia and displayed there, which led Nikita Khrushchev to visit the San Jose facility to see the machines in their natural environment. The 305 came at the wrong time, perhaps. There were other systems that used similar technologies at a lower price point by that time. But there was also a more developed system that had been introduced even prior, that once it took the technology of the RAMAC, became much more popular. The IBM 650 was introduced in 1954, and it sold fairly well early on, but in 56, after the release of the 305, sales greatly increased as it was sold as the IBM 650 RAMAC. The RAMAC was the best-selling computer of the 1950s, selling more than 2,000 units before it was withdrawn from the market. I believe along with all the other IBM vacuum tube machines, they were all discontinued in 1962. The 650 RAMAC became popular for use as a printing system, especially with companies like utilities. The machines were considered cheaper than their larger, more powerful systems, so dumping data to a card deck and then printing on the 650 was a fairly economical way to go for large installations. The larger system that might be used to print from included the IBM 704, and its more successful follow-on, the 709. The 709, though, had a very short lifespan, partly because it was a vacuum tube machine at the end of that era. It was only a year later that IBM introduced the transistorized version, the IBM 7090, which was a major step forward for IBM in general. The 704 and 709 were scientific computers, though like all computers at the time, they were used in non-scientific methods as well. They weren't quite what we would consider supercomputers today, but they were powerful scientific computers that were used in applications ranging from chemical analysis to rocket design. The world of computer chess also really kicked off here as Alex Bernstein created a chess engine for the IBM 704 that could play a full game at the rate of 8 minutes per move. It apparently did run faster on the 709, but it was the start of something. RCA was another major player, and they had been a big name in developing transistor technologies. The Bismack was IBM's entry into the big time, as they had signed a government contract to work on logistics for the Mutual Assistance Program, a foreign aid project to help rebuild Europe after World War II. The Bismack only delivered 6 machines, largely because it was huge. But they were sent to groups like Higbee's Department Stores, Travelers Insurance, New York Life Insurance, major companies that had significant accounting matters. I always thought Bismack stood for business machine, but apparently it was actually like a real acronym for something. Bismack was a cool machine, and one of the reasons why is because legendary engineer Arnold Spielberg had worked on it, developing a search methodology. It led to the RCA 501, which really put RCA into the game when it was introduced in 1958. It was the machine that got people thinking that transistorized computers had serious potential for use as general computing technologies, even though IBM either had or was about to introduce the 7090. Now, the key difference there is that the 7090 was for governmental groups. The 501 was for business. These machines were designed for major work at major corporations and institutions. This was a class of machine, though they were really designed to be used for things that required serious number crunching, where speed was a factor but cost was less so. There was a class that was designed for smaller institutions and had a somewhat narrower sort of use. These machines were marketed towards individual units of large organizations, smaller, though sizable businesses, and university departments. The LGP-30 from Libroscope was a small machine, the size of a convenience store ice cream chest. It was drum-based, and it used a few vacuum tubes. Now that meant it was not nearly as fast, but was much cheaper than other things that were on the market. It was also something of a reduced instruction set machine, as there were only 16 commands total. It used 113 vacuum tubes, along with implementing that with diode logic. It was all held on a single card. Now, one of the developments done at Dartmouth, and we'll be doing an entire episode about BASIC and Dartmouth's role in the history of programming languages. And what Dartmouth had done is they created a version of Algol 60 for their LGP-30. This is an excellent example of what groups will do to make use of what they have, and universities are famous for this. They will take a program, and Algol 60, a full implementation on an LGP-30 would be impossible. But developing a version of it that could run on their machine, that's a good thing. The other machine, and one with an incredible pedigree, is the Bendix G15. That was designed by Harry Huskey, who worked with Alan Turing on the design of the ACE in the UK, and we've spoken about his work earlier on SWAC. The G15 was inspired by Huskey's work on the ACE, and it was a very small machine. The CPU was the size of a refrigerator, though I should note it is still large enough to knock the wind out of you if you had ended up backed into you while you were moving it onto display. That happened to me twice. It had two optional tape drives that were roughly the same size. It was also drum-based and fairly fast for what you got, and certainly fast for what you paid for, because it could be sold and operated at a much lower cost, even a lower cost than the LGP-30. Now, the biggest market for the G15 was from civil engineers, and they had a lot longer lifespan, partly because of this, because they weren't purchased by government agencies for classified use, and thus they could be passed on to schools. Fremont High School in Oakland, California was given one, and they used it for many years. Other schools used them to serve as the basis for early vocational computer training. As always, it's rarely the intended use that has the longest reaching impact, as this was the first time individuals were able to get their hands on machines. Because this was, in a way, a very personal machine. It was at a human level. It wasn't too much bigger than you, the ability to crush you, moving it aside. But it could also be operated by a single individual. You didn't need the classic separation of the operator and the programmer. You could have it as one. Now, the end of the 1950s was also more or less the end of the vacuum tube era. IBM transitioned to transistors with the 7000 series, and RCA and General Electric were right up there with them. Machines like the 709 and the 650 led the way for greater integration of computers into the military and into the governmental space, which is also important. I know one individual by the name of Ray Nelson, wonderful science fiction author, most famous for writing the story that would become They Live, first got his hands on a computer with a 650 RAMAC while he was in the Navy. It's interesting that the LGP-30 and the Bendix G15 led to the introduction of computers into smaller and more niche spaces that existed outside of the governmental realm. It is those machines that led most directly to the market that would dominate most of the 1960s and 70s, the mini-computers. Thanks for listening to Computer History with Chris Garcia. The next two episodes will be machine-specific and first show up on our Patreon. They'll be about SAGE, the semi-automatic round environment, and then on the PDP-1. We'll follow those up with two full episodes. The first on languages from the beginning through 1960. So we'll be talking about Fortran, COBOL, ALGOL, Lisp, you name it, we'll probably at least glance over it. And then one on IBM, 1960 to 1965. Yes, I promise I'll get back to the European and the Japanese scene, I swear, but I've just got a lot of IBM research. And with that, thank you so much for listening to Computer History. I'm Chris Garcia.